So I'm Mark Docherty, I'm the Executive Director of Nursing and Clinical Commissioning at West Midlands Ambulance Service. So winter's been a very, very difficult time for us. Probably not so much by way of activity. Our activity levels are probably around 10% down on where we would normally expect them to be at this time of year. But of course, the big thing that's really impacting us is the delays when we get to hospitals. Some of those delays can be very, very long, many hours, sometimes as long as maybe 20 hours. So we're losing a lot of ambulance resource with those delays at hospital, which inevitably means we've got less resource to respond to patients. And from a patient perspective, what that means is patients are waiting a lot longer than they should be. And that's a real concern for us as a service. We're an emergency service, and every category of patient is being affected, from the life-threatened patients who we're just not getting to in a timely way, right through to the lower categories of patients where they're maybe lying on the floor for many hours, and by the time we get to them, they've become more unwell, and therefore we've got a more difficult situation to deal with. So the winter's been very, very difficult, and are things getting better? They're not, sadly. We're noticing that the number of hours we're losing due to handover delays at hospital are generally going up. The last month, December, we lost over 45,000 hours in the month. That's operational hours that otherwise could have been used for responding to patients. So yeah, a very, very challenging time, if I'm being honest. Some people that fall are a simple fall of a healthy patient. So this is not the type of patient we're talking about here. I'm specifically looking at the frail elderly faller, people who maybe are quite fragile at the best of times. It doesn't take a lot to push them over and make them very unwell. So these are patients that, without categorization, they're not immediately life-threatened. Actually, if we don't get a response to them quickly, they will become unwell. So my concern with these patients is they're lying on often hard floors. Even if they're carpeted floors, they're still relatively hard when compared to sort of a soft mattress. Sometimes they're lying in exposed places, so they might be outside in the elements. If they're not outside in the elements, sometimes they're on the floor in a house that maybe isn't heated all the time. So they're very vulnerable to a lot of things, to temperature, to pressure damage, and also to sort of nutritional needs and hydration. So these are patients, for example, if they don't eat and drink regular, if they don't take their medications, they're very vulnerable and at risk of becoming exceptionally unwell. So sometimes by the time we get to these patients, they're in a very poor physical state, caused predominantly by them lying on the floor and not the fall. So one of the projects is looking specifically at care homes where we've got mainly frail elderly people in the care homes, and we know from our evidence that these people on occasions do fall in the care home. And some care homes have a no-lift policy, which means the patient can be on the floor for a very, very long period of time. Now, when we were able to get to these patients in a very timely way, we could say that actually not moving them, not allowing them to eat and drink was the right thing to do. But actually, when they're long lies on the floor, that's the wrong thing to do. So even somebody, for example, that may be at risk of having injured or fractured their hip or their neck or femur, we do question whether the traditional advice of not moving them and not allowing them to eat or drink or take tablets is the right thing. So we're trying to move away from looking at that traditional advice to actually saying the important thing for these patients is to get them into a comfortable position where they're able to be looked after properly whilst awaiting the ambulance. So things like the Mangarelp are really good because it allows patients to safely be taken off the floor where actually the risk reduces by getting them off the floor and getting them into a comfortable position. Now that sometimes may mean the ambulance isn't needed if we can be sure there's no injury to the patient, but even if the ambulance is needed, at least we've got the patient into a safe position whilst they await the ambulance. So, you know, that's what we're trying to work along or with at the moment. And, you know, I think we can take that project a lot further and look at an industrial scale ability of this. So at the moment, whilst we're concentrating on care homes, there is the possibility that we could roll this out big time to allow it as an opportunity for example, first responders to use if they're attending a patient who's likely to be on the floor for a long period of time. So we see a lot of scope for this type of product being used in the future to help these people who otherwise will come to harm if they're lying for a long period of time on the floor. Mm-hmm. So for example, on a typical 12-hour shift, a paramedic and technician crew would normally deal with around 7 to 8 patients. With the current difficulties we have with handing patients over, that number can be as few as 3 patients on a 12-hour shift. And that's not what our paramedics and technicians want to do, particularly when they know there's patients out there waiting for their help. That's really, really frustrating. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, they get very frustrated and demoralised that when they attend the patient, sometimes they're turning up to patients who have passed away whilst waiting for an ambulance, or indeed, by the time they get to the patient actually is in a very poor state, or in a poor state and we've got angry relatives because they too are frustrated. So it really does get to people's confidence and morale. You know, when people that have come into the health service to be out there all the time helping people are frustrated in their attempts to get out there and do the job that they're trained to do and that they're really very good at doing. So it is a difficult environment at the moment. I don't see that it's radically going to get better anytime soon. So to some extent what we've got to do is start to work around all the challenges that we've got. So where we've got patients waiting long periods of time, we've got to make sure that we provide the utmost level of patient care and safety to that patient. And we've got to make sure that we do everything in our power to deliver the care that we can with the current challenges that the NHS is facing, albeit that it's very difficult for staff. You know, I know we've got a group of staff that will never, ever give up on patients. They will always try their best.